My name is Dwyer and I make the Irish History podcast, which has been running since 2010. I grew up in County Kilkenny, and I guess I would have spent a lot of time surrounded by ruins, medieval ruins, castles, monasteries. I used to play as a child. I'd be brought to castles in the surrounding area and you'd play there, and I guess that would have developed an interest just in history on a very basic level. I guess the aim of the podcast is maybe to give, through history, is to give people a similar enough insight into the past, that it's like a real living thing, that the things that explain the world the way it is today, stories of the people, oftentimes are like traumatic, dark stories, but I think they're the ones that are important, and we can learn from it as well. Obviously the podcast to an extent has to be history focused, but you can't help that the present also inevitably bleeds into us, because the podcast covers a lot of the rich history of Dublin, but the amazing thing is that you can actually see a lot of the places where some of these stories played out, where some of these people lived, and these events that had such a huge impact on Irish history took place. So maybe we can go and look at some of those. So we're here in St. Mickens, which used to be at the heart of one of the worst slums in Victorian Dublin, which is really important in terms of the story of the famine. So in the surrounding areas, you would have had some of the poorest people living in Dublin, and obviously when a famine hit Dublin, these were the most vulnerable people in the city. There was no running water, there was no sewage, there was only 4 or 5 pumps across this entire parish for 20,000 people. People used to reuse water. You're talking about a mortality rate in children that was appalling. 6 in every 10 children in this parish died before they reached their teenage years. So that's kind of the level of deprivation you're talking about. So behind me here is Hendrix Street, and in the 1840s, this is a bit of a mixed street, so you had lots of different houses. Here you would have had some middle class families, and then at number 6 and number 7 Hendrix Street were 2 tenement buildings where very poor families in Dublin lived, and it was actually at the back of number 6 Hendrix Street where one of the first deaths from starvation took place, and the story of the family who died in behind that is pretty tragic. Unfortunately for the Mulhern family, it was John and Ellen Mulhern and 3 daughters and a son. Life proved to be very difficult. The father, John, couldn't find regular work, and by late 1846, as the famine crisis in the city deepened, they were really struggling to survive. They were dependent on soup kitchens. They could only find intermittent work. The parents were getting some food, but it seems they were giving that food to their children. Sadly, the 2 parents, John and Ellen Mulhern, died within 24 hours of each other. When the autopsies were carried out, it was discovered that they'd actually died not from disease, but essentially from starvation. What was called at the time, they were deprived of the necessities of life. It's worth bearing in mind this family were actually so poor in Dublin that they couldn't even afford a room in the house, and when they died, they were living in what was a mud hut at the back of the house. But it's just here behind me that they would become, I suppose, recorded as the first deaths from starvation in the city. Since I've started making the podcast, it's definitely one thing that interests me is how people respond in crises. There are actually, you can see similar characteristics about how people respond when it does seem like the world is totally falling apart. And Irish history would traditionally have focused on the idea that Irish people were just kind of almost passive victims in this story, and I was quite interested in these people desperately trying to survive. So the Great Famine ended in the early 1850s, and Irish society was absolutely devastated. 1 million people had died, more than 1 million had emigrated, so the population had fallen roughly by about 25% not long after the famine, in a very short space of time. The implications of this were huge. It pretty much changed every single aspect of Irish society. There's almost no way aspect in terms of culture, politics, music, everything changed.